Good evening and welcome. I'm Elisa Stern, Director of Supportive Services at Bikur Cholim Chesed Organization. I'm so pleased to be with you here tonight, along with my friend and colleague, Dr. Irit Felsen. This event is the first in a series of discussions held monthly for members of the second generation called Survivor Families, Our Parents, Ourselves, Our Changing Lives. These monthly gatherings were made possible by a grant from the Jewish Federations of North America through their Center for Advancing Holocaust Survivor Care. With their generous help, we're able to come together this evening. We're also grateful to the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany for its ongoing support of Bikur Cholim's social services for Holocaust survivors. Feel free to take a leaflet describing our program, which you'll find on the registration table right outside. Please contact us if you know of a Holocaust survivor who can benefit from the services we offer with funding from the Claims Conference. Please note that while the discussion is being recorded tonight, it is only available to Bikur Cholim staff for internal use. This will help us capture valuable information shared by Dr. Felsen, which we will later transform into a series of articles. Dr. Irit Felsen, our group facilitator, is a clinical psychologist and adjunct professor of psychology at Yeshiva University. In both her research and clinical work, Dr. Felsen has a strong interest in trauma, loss, and displacement, particularly as it affects survivors of the Shoah and their descendants. She's a member of the American Academy of Experts in Traumatic Stress, a researcher with the Yale University Trauma Study Group, and a member of the UN NGO on mental health, in which she has recently presented a talk about trauma and the family. Earlier in time, Dr. Felsen ran a second-generation group for many years, as she served as coordinator of Holocaust services at Jewish Family Services of Metro West, New Jersey. Currently, a consultant to several national and community organizations that provide services to Holocaust survivors and their loved ones, Dr. Felsen is a recognized expert in the area of Holocaust survivor families. It's our pleasure to have Dr. Felsen here tonight to lead our discussion.
Thank you very much, Elisa. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. I wanted to just stress one point. When Elisa says that it's audio taped and it will be transcribed and whatever will be done with it, of course, it will not include any identifying data of the actual participants in any way. So no names, of course, will be mentioned, and in cases where somebody feels that where there is something that could identify the person, it will be changed. That's very important for me to say. It is really a very meaningful thing for me to be here with you tonight, and my hope is that this is not going to be a lecture, that this is not a lecture series, but a discussion series. So my sense is that, first of all, since this is our first meeting, first in 10, since this is the first one, today I would like to take a few moments at some point, perhaps before I speak or after I speak my piece, to discuss what brings you here. If people could say, since this is a relatively more intimate circle, it's not the big, lecture like we had a couple of years ago, maybe people can say what is on their minds, what was the issue of interest to them currently that they would like addressed here. And because it's very important to me to address what is currently a problem, what is currently of interest to you. There's so many other aspects that we can address, and our lives interact with our legacy of being children of survivors, and our issues were different when we were adolescents. They were different when we were first married. They were different when we became parents. They're different now. So I want to leave us some room to gather that very important information of where you're at here, why you're here, and what you're hoping to get out of this. So I thought that as a nice kind of warm-up today for sure, and probably in all of our meetings, unless you tell me differently, I thought I would always start by addressing a certain issue. Hopefully an issue that I will get from you is of interest to you. And I will say a little piece about that, and then we will open it to a discussion. That is kind of the plan, but like I said, it's a very interactive thing that we will change according to your input. Okay? Okay, so why don't we do this? Why don't we start by going around, and if everybody could just say their first name and say a couple of words, yes, is that okay? About what they would like addressed here. You know, of course, there were issues that we had to deal with when our parents were still alive, and there are many of us, myself included, who no longer have our parents with us. But the fact that we are children of survivors, and the way that it has been for us all those years with our parents and now without them, is still a very relevant aspect of who we are. So whether it's about how we were with our parents and how we come to terms with it, and whether it is how we are with completely different issues in our lives, but related to that and in ways that are informed or affected by that. By the way, I gave Elisa something to share with you. I just want to say that perhaps before I even do the round, if you don't mind, I want to read to you a few, just a part, not the whole thing, just a few of the lines from this thing called Playing the Holocaust Card, which you have there and you can follow. It was in the Times of Israel this week because of Yom HaShoah, because of the fact that there was all kinds of talk about playing the Holocaust card. It was mentioned by several public figures in England, in Israel. There was a whole discussion about it. So I thought that it would be a nice thing for us to look at for a minute, and I would like to read out these lines. So here I'm going to the second little paragraph. Here's the thing about playing the Holocaust card. For me, and many like me, children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, the Holocaust is not a card. It is the hand that we were dealt. And Holocaust remembrance is not a day, it is a lifetime. Let me say up front that I would not, heaven forbid, compare our suffering to that of our parents and grandparents, whose numbers are dwindling. I'm skipping. Like most second Gs, second generation, yes, that's what we shorten it for, second G. Like most second Gs, what we children of survivors call ourselves, I woke up as a toddler and throughout my childhood to the screaming nightmares of my parents. I rifled through the lingerie drawer of my mother's best friend, who promised herself as a teen that if she survived Auschwitz, she would buy only the best. And I watched her roll up a piece of wedding cake in the hem of her dress when Alzheimer's forced her to relive the Holocaust until her death. I was raised by parents who feared authority, sickness, starvation, cold, heat, crowding, isolation, and the other. That is to say, anyone who did not hail from a decimated family like my own. The enemy could be anyone in a uniform, a policeman, a ticketing agent at the airport, a server in a restaurant, or a ranger in a park. A cold could turn into typhus. A crowd could become murderous. A person speaking German on the bus could be a cue to get off at the next stop, regardless of where we were going. I was raised with no evidence of my history, no heirlooms, no photographs, no grandparents, no ancestral home. I thought that, by the way, if you read the rest of it, I think you would find it very interesting. It's very well written. And I thought it's a good beginning for us to sort of start from that, because that is very much a description of many of us. That it's not just about how do we deal with our parents while our parents are alive. It's how we are and how we deal and how we experience a lot of things, regardless of whether our dear parents are still with us or not.
Here we have a comment from the audience, bringing up abuse in survivor families.
So here is the thing. I want to tell you something. For many, many years, there was complete silence in the professional literature about this aspect of the abusive Holocaust survivors as parents. And I have to admit to you that 20 years ago, when I was giving lectures about, let me start by this. Before we even continue the circle, I will tell you that I ask you to be, I ask for your tolerance in this discussion today and in all of our meetings, because it's a very touchy subject. And while we're gathering here, all of us as children of survivors, to speak about something that only we share, nobody else, and the literature shows that children of Holocaust survivors working with children of Holocaust survivors have better results than other people working with them, because we share something on a level does not even require the words. We understand certain things beyond the words, and it's a good thing. But even amongst us, there are many differences. The Holocaust affected a huge number of people, a huge range of people, and even within our experience, there are many differences and many different opinions. And to even talk about some of these aspects is very touchy. And always, there's often, when I talk about it, there's often somebody who feels very offended. How do we dare speak about this, or how do we dare speak about that? And the issue of the abuse, I have to tell you, I'm very impressed with the courage that you had to put it out there already today, just as we start, because for years I would give a talk, and we would talk about all the other things about Holocaust survivors, their depression, their anxiety, their overprotectiveness, their overvaluation of their kids, a lot of things, and the difficulties that it created, but nobody dared to speak about the abuse. And I would go outside. I have to admit to you, I'm an Israeli, and I would go after my lecture outside to have a smoke. I no longer do that, I want you to know. But thank you. Thank you. But I would go out to have a smoke, and invariably somebody would come after me, and another person would come afterwards and say, you know, I want you to know that my parents were very abusive to me, but nobody talks about it, and we didn't have the nerve to address it. The first papers about it started to come out only in the beginning of 2000s, 2001, 2003. We began to address this issue because it was so painful and so terrible. Who would dare to be the person who writes about Holocaust survivors who suffered so much, and now we tell, that kind of stuff about them? I have to tell you, when I went to do my dissertation, I was working for the Israeli government in Hamburg, in Germany. I was a representative of the Israeli government there, doing some work for them, and I, at the same time, did my PhD. And when I told my professor at the university, who was not a German, he was a Finnish guy, whose parents also suffered a lot during the war and were not German, yes? When I told him that this was my topic, the topic of my dissertation for the master's degree was the identification patterns of children of survivors with their parents, he was very angry with me, and he said to me, how dare you? How dare you talk about any kind of negative effect that the second generation might have had? It's like blaming the victims. And I said, no. I was young and I was very intimidated, but I did manage to say, I'm not blaming them. The blame lies with the people who victimized them. I'm just showing that this continues and that the damage doesn't stop with the parents. So I'm just asking you, I say, kol hakavod to you that you put it out there already. We know that, I know from my practice, I know what a large-scale problem it actually was. It wasn't just one or two. There were many parents who were not abusive. There were many parents who were very loving. There were also quite a few parents who were very abusive. My own parents had a best friend whose daughter was much older than I, so I didn't see it with my own eyes anymore. But when she was a kid at home, my parents told me that she would run to their house black and blue from the way that he hit her. So, yeah, we know that it's a problem, and hopefully this will be a safe enough space in which we can talk about everything, the good and the bad, with tolerance for one another and for each other's different experiences. I grew up in Rechavia in Jerusalem, the bastion of a lot of survivors, and we didn't have grandparents. It was a country without grandparents for the most part. No Ashkenazi grandparents. So there was one grandparent, the mother of one family that survived. She was Oma for all of us. We shared her. The place where I find myself, which is so interesting for me, is between being a clinician that sees, and I love my second generation patients. This is my family. This is my extended family that I didn't have, right? And we have that very special connection that is very, very meaningful. I also had relatively very healthy parents. So it was a very happy house. And I think studies show also that in some ways it was easier in Israel because we were outside, we had the whole, support outside and all of that. So it's a little different, and I see it as a very special resource to be able from that place to relate, because I still have a lot of the same stuff and issues. So, and on the other hand, I'm a researcher. Why am I a researcher? Because exactly like you said, if we look at one individual and another one, we don't know what's related to Holocaust, what's not. We don't have a control group. Everybody has their one life. We don't know. But if you look at large samples, hundreds of people, and you compare systematically and methodically, if you see that certain things are typical to this group and are not like this in the other group, over the hundreds of people, you can say, okay, then it might be related to the fact that this group is Holocaust and this group is not. And that's where I think the intersection between research and clinical work is so important. So that's what I like to do, is to do that and bring into our discussion, not just, okay, so what's your experience, but what can I tell you as someone who's researched it for 25 years. I have a lot of material, but it's not running away. Today is mainly understanding what you are, who you are, and what you want. Hopefully we'll get to show you just a touch of something. But one of the things that I would like your input on is my plan is to use excerpts of various documentaries and movies, not about the camps and terrible scenes from the Holocaust, but documentaries that were made by second generation about our experience, because some of them are excellent, and I would like to share with you little bits and pieces as another way for us to enrich the discussion. And about that, by the way, you will see I will bring you the movie Because of That War by two Israeli musicians, my age, my generation, Yehuda Poliker and Yaakov Cohen. And there is a scene there which you will see where Yehuda Poliker's father from Greece, he was from Greece, and they were taken to Auschwitz in the trains, Saloniki. And he says that in the bar mitzvah of his son, everything was ready, the tables were waiting and set up for the guests. And when he looked at the family sitting there, he saw in his head the entire family that should have been there, that wasn't there. And he just went into a fit and turned, kicked the tables and he was just because of that. But I'll bring the excerpt from the documentary. Thank you all very, very much for being here and for the little bit that you chose to share with us. Let me show you something to start with. I also have, by the way, I brought these. I don't really want to schlep them again, but I want to show it to you. This is Art Spiegelman's very famous first ever book that was created in this way about his experiences as a child of survivors in the form of a comic strip, but very powerful. You see the whole thing, the whole story is told in this way. And this one I will use here and there. I'll copy some pictures to show you. This was not translated into Hebrew. It was written in French and in Hebrew by this guy who lives in Israel. He's an artist in Israel, Michel Kishka. And it's called The Second Generation, Things I Never Told My Father. And I will show you in a minute one picture of it and another one that I hope to get to today, just as a beginning for our discussion. I really recommend that you look at Maus. It's a very famous piece of work and very powerful. So what is this picture I'm showing you? This is the picture of our parents, over 70 and more, actually, studies of very large samples internationally in many countries of the world. We have a very sophisticated method of combining statistically, mathematically, the effects of different studies, weighing them by the number, the size of the sample, the type of all kinds of other factors that we put into the equation, and we can sort of do a comparison of many studies. So this is, we call it a meta-analysis. It's a meta-analysis of many, many studies of samples of survivors. And these are the examples of various aspects that were looked into. If you look, you'll see total adjustment, physical health, psychological well-being, post-traumatic stress symptoms in the center, yes, psychological symptomatology, cognitive functioning, stress-related physiology. Look at that. If you look at many, many samples, many, many studies internationally, what you see is that, as a rule, the survivor population is not different. See, one bar is the survivors, and one bar is the other bar. Never mind now the difference that you don't see. They're kind of insignificant, the differences, on all of those other variables, except this enormous difference in post-traumatic stress. So even when somebody says, my parents were relatively healthy like mine, my parents did not have clinical depression, did not, I have a patient that I saw last night, my last patient last night. She said her father did very well in this country. He made a lot of money. He created a beautiful family, a whole tribe. He has functioned very well. But he cries at the drop of a hat. I mean, he cries at anything. Everything brings it up. That, to me, as a clinician, immediately says that this is a man who, despite his very high functioning, lived with rather acute post-traumatic stress symptoms throughout his life. Other people had maybe acute post-traumatic symptoms for several years, and then they got better. We know from studies of all kinds of post-traumatic populations that, as a rule, a third gets better spontaneously after several years. They just get better, and they no longer fulfill clinical criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. A third does not. A third goes on to having what we call a chronic and complex post-traumatic stress disorder at different levels. They can have very severe post-traumatic symptoms. Doesn't mean that they don't have good functioning and that they don't get up every day and go to work and run a business and all of that. But they can cry at the drop of a hat, or they can lose their temper at the drop of a hat. They can be aggressive in their family. They can be, they can do all kinds of things parallel to good functioning in some areas. And a third is in between. They're not exactly recovered, and they're not exactly chronically PTSD'd. They're anywhere in between. That's what we know in general. But what you see from this is the extent of post-traumatic symptomatology in the population of Holocaust survivors as a rule. It's very high. Yes, they were not more, no, you don't see more schizophrenia, none of those things. What you see is a huge spike in post-traumatic stress disorder. So even when and all of these, by the way, let me make another thing clear. All of these studies are studies that were conducted on so-called normative populations. So it did not include, this meta-analysis did not include all the other studies that included people who had psychiatric illness, that were hospitalized at some point or were treated. These are just regular community residing, functioning Holocaust survivors, yes? Because one of the criticisms of the studies initially that looked at survivors or children of survivors, this was the big criticism of the initial studies about the second generation was, yeah, sure, you're looking at all the people who have problems, who come to psychologists because they have problems, and then you say that their problems are because their parents are Holocaust survivors. Who said so? You're just looking at people that come to clinical, psychologists because they have problems. So it's very important that we moved to the next step of looking at community residing non-clinical survivors and non-clinical children of survivors, and we see what we see nonetheless. There are many indications in very strong methodological empirical studies that show us that there is a relationship between PTSD and cognitive impairment in older age. It is both related to earlier cognitive aging. So, for example, there's a very long study that was conducted in Israel on POWs of the Yom Kippur War. And they were followed from the time that they returned to Israel. They're still being followed. And some of them are my friends. One of them is a psychologist, one of them is a psychiatrist in Israel, and the person running it is a colleague of mine and a friend. It's been running since then. And what we see is that their symptoms, the more severe the symptoms of PTSD are, in those people you see often early cognitive early general aging, not just cognitive, more symptoms, physiological symptoms, less good functioning in many areas of life earlier than in the other ones who are also combat soldiers at the Yom Kippur War but did not have PTSD. So, and you see earlier cognitive aging, so problems with memory, problems with cognitive functioning. That's one thing. In another group of studies that were conducted on American combat veterans, we see very clearly also same pattern that if you take combatants, if you take veterans of the same war theater that spend time in the same place in the war, and you take those with PTSD and those without PTSD, and you compare them, you see that the ones with PTSD have more prevalence of dementia of all kinds, not just Alzheimer's, that dementia and cognitive impairment are higher in this group than in the group that doesn't have PTSD. Now, keep in mind, there are two possibilities here. There is a bi-directional relationship, which we are still exploring and by more studies. One thing is that when you have PTSD, essentially what we know is that the brain is flooded continuously with various chemicals, natural chemicals that are the stress hormones and their derivatives. Those hormones are supposed to do certain things to the body that are to make it possible for us to withstand extraordinary stress, get through it, and immediately, when the stress is over, they're supposed to stop so that we can resume normal functioning. If those neuropeptides in the brain don't stop, don't get the order to stop being produced, if they continue to be produced, then we remain physiologically under conditions of extreme stress response, which are, for the long run, very, very bad for our brain and for our bodies. So there's a very, very good book, by the way, that was written called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which is exactly about that, because in the wild, in nature, the stress response is much better controlled in animals. So the zebra sees the tiger, the stress response kicks in, the zebra runs like a bat out of you-know-what, and because now all of its energy is directed to this fight or flight response, not to the digestive system, not to other things. Certain areas in the brain, I can show you a picture of PET scans. We have now neuroimaging techniques that are non-intrusive, right? I can show you pictures of a brain when it's in rest, in normal state, and a brain when under conditions of the PET scan, the patient is asked to think about their PTSD event. There are clear areas in the brain that go offline. They just go offline. It's dark. There is no electric activity in those parts of the brain under activation of PTSD. And other things happen in the body. So if the PTSD response in the zebra gets activated, the zebra flees. And once it flees and it's in safety, the other neuropeptides kick in and stop the stress reaction from being active, and the zebra is fine, and that's why zebras don't get ulcers. However, people are much more complex, and so these things get a little bit famished for us, a little bit more, and so we think about it more, and we start thinking what we could have done and what we should have done and why it happened to us and how is it my fault, and all kinds of things like that. And our physiology of stress is much more complicated by all of these processes. So for us, sometimes it doesn't stop. And when it doesn't stop, it creates long-term damage, both cognitively and otherwise. So what we see, for example, in postmortem examinations of brains of people who had PTSD, we see that their hippocampus, which is a very important part of the brain, has less volume. Now, we don't know exactly yet if they have less volume, smaller hippocampus, because they had smaller hippocampus to begin with, and that's why they were more susceptible to PTSD, or if the stress hormones killed cells over time and made the hippocampus smaller. So what am I saying with regards to the bidirectional relationship between PTSD and dementia? What we are now still exploring is, do people have dementia because they had PTSD and the PTSD killed brain cells? Yes? And that's why they have dementia? Or does dementia, which we also know is true, yes, does dementia sort of release all kinds of inhibitions and defenses that were there before? It corrodes them. So now when the person has dementia, the PTSD comes out. Both of them are true. It is true that when people, sometimes we see that when people get cognitively impaired, like in the thing that I just read to you, right, about this woman who clearly came out of the Holocaust well, but when Alzheimer's came, it sort of pushed her back into her Holocaust, and she was hiding a piece of cake in from the wedding in the hem of her skirt, right? The thing that I just read to you. Yes, when people get some level of cognitive impairment, we often see them going back to their PTSD memories. We see that very frequently with our aging parents when they go to hospital and they have anesthesia. They wake up from anesthesia and they are in the Holocaust. You know, I remember it from my father. It was so scary. I mean, he was okay, and then he woke up from anesthesia and he was completely, the Nazis were there and the Nazis were there. And I have a friend whose father is a Holocaust expert, researcher, who had gotten this very prestigious prize award at Yad Vashem one day. The next week he went into the hospital. He was completely clear and everything. After the anesthesia, she called me. She says, Irit, Abba sheli b'machane rikuz. You know, he came out of it. He came out of it. And sometimes people don't come out of it. Sometimes people don't come out of it when they're older. When they're older. He was not yet quite so old. The chances are much better. When they're really old, when it's people in their late 80s, you know, it's very dangerous, and they can just not be re-stabilized again. Yes, it's a very, very frightening thing. So we know that happens, that dementia and cognitive impairment and anesthesia and anything like that cognitively impairs our ability to use all of our capacities to shove the bad memories down, releases them and has the risk of them coming up and flooding us. But there is very strong evidence that suggests that also indeed organically PTSD damages the body and the brain over long periods of time. There is a whole array of more diseases. There is more autoimmune diseases. There is more skeletal pain conditions. They're all pain conditions. There is more lung disease. There is more cardiovascular disease. There is more gastrointestinal disease. There is more all diseases. What we certainly don't want, and I cannot be more passionate about it than, I'm really involved with this very much right now. The issue of treating Holocaust survivors when they're ill, when they're in pain, when they're dying. You know, there is nothing that is more critical than making sure that they die in peace and that they don't suffer and that they do not experience any sense of lack of empathy and of people being insensitive to their suffering at that point in life. And there will be, we will definitely talk about that specifically with your permission. You know, if that's something that you would like, I would like to speak about that specifically in one of our meetings, kind of dedicate a meeting to that. Okay, this is my one and only family photo that is of my father's family before the Holocaust. And my father is there. He was the only son amongst 8 sisters, which he always complained about. But, and I also told my neighbor when he had 5 girls and he had the 6th girl, I said, you know, Matt, if you're aiming for that boy, I just want to let you know that it can take a while. So, you know, my father and 4 sisters survived. The other 4 sisters were killed. My father was in a concentration camp in Poland and came to Palestine after the war with my mother. This is the front of the book, Ador Hashani, the second generation, this one which I showed you, and I took that picture as a nice sort of way to start with our group today, because maybe it doesn't show so well, but look here, it's better. What you see here is a cap from the concentration camp, and this is him, Michel Kishka. He's standing on it, and in a way, I guess what he's trying to communicate with that picture, with that drawing, is that the Holocaust and Auschwitz were the stage on which his life took place. By the way, it's a very interesting thing that I'll just throw in here as we talk. Another very painful tidbit is that while some of the large community studies, for example, Siegel and Weinfeld ran a large random community study in Canada of the second generation, and he's a very respected researcher. I really have a lot of respect for him. He's a much, much older, my parents' age generation researcher, Canadian, not child of survivors. They ran a big random study, and they came out with the conclusion that there were no differences in their study between the Jewish descendants of the Holocaust and controls, with one strange findings which they did not have an explanation for, which was that the children of survivors had a higher frequency of suicided siblings. So Michel Kishka's brother, unfortunately, is one of those people who committed suicide. Their findings showed that in the samples that they talked to, they didn't see differences. However, there is a possibility, how do we explain such a finding? There's a possibility that there is a group that's very injured that didn't make it to the sample, right? Because they suicided already. One of the main themes that I would like to just introduce today, and I will definitely expand on next time, is what I call the dual reality of children of survivors. Yes? And it's exactly this, the fact that someone places themselves and their own life and their own evolving identity so powerfully on the stage of their parents' past. This is what we talk about. So what I say about it in the slide, if you want to try and read it, is what I call the dual reality of the children of survivors, is that we all live in our own reality, our here and now, my Israeli reality in which I grew up, which was, it may sound strange to you at this point, but it felt very safe. It felt very, I was in my own country. I felt very safe. I felt very good. You grew up in the States. It was also very safe, very affluent. Everything was fine. Canada, Denmark, all of those safe places for us. And yet, and we have certain rules of behavior in this reality of ours, right? We are supposed to be nice. We're supposed to give people their turn. We're supposed to wait our turn. We're supposed to be polite. We're supposed to be to behave in socially desirable ways. All of those rules that apply to life under optimal conditions in safe and socially ordered societies. Yes? At the same time, we all have a very, very real and palpable other reality that is very, very relevant for us, that other people don't have. We have in the backdrop, just like he has it here in the backdrop, we all have in the backdrop, in a very real way, the reality of the Holocaust. All the time. And the way that I see it, and the way that I explain it, if you like, I use the metaphor of the glass floor. And some of you who heard me speak heard it before, but I think it's a very important way for me to explain it. Think of it as we live above a glass floor. We live above the glass floor our entire life in our reality. In the States, in Canada, in Israel, and people are fine and people are pleasant and you are giving people their turn and you're waiting your turn and all of that. That's the reality of the here and now and how we're supposed to behave. And that's how we were raised to behave, and that's how people behave around us more or less, and that's the way we live. But for us, children of survivors, there is a glass floor. And the glass floor is transparent. That's why I call it a glass floor. And underneath the glass floor, in that Unterwelt, is the world of the Holocaust. And all of the ways that we heard that people behaved, all the unthinkable things that we know people did, not only the victimizers, but also what happens to good people when you put them in a situation where they're starved to death and where they try to steal a piece of bread from you to give to their child, or all of that, the entire horrible, horrifying world as it's described, for example, in this very powerful book by Primo Levi, the Ashokim v'Hanitzalim, The Sunken and the Saved. Yes, Primo Levi was a chemist, a doctor of chemistry, Italian. He was actually the focus of a program of Yom HaShoah at the United Nations last Wednesday. They did a very, very fine job. And this book, he wrote the book, If This Is Man, describing his experiences, and he wrote the book, The Sunken and the Saved, which is considered his philosophical and ethical testament. And as a chemist, he wrote a very precise and very unwavering description of exactly what he saw in Auschwitz on all levels, what happened, what the perpetrators did, what happened to people when you put them in that kind of a situation. Very precise, because it was very important for him to do two things: to make sure that nobody will be able to say that these things didn't happen, and to also show what can happen to good people, to averagely good people, when you put them in such conditions, so that we will not think that this was a single event that cannot happen again, but that we will always be aware of our responsibility and our role in preventing anything from getting to such conditions where even average people become, desperately monstrous. Yes. So the dual reality is underneath that glass floor, is everything that we know, that we heard, that we learned, that we grasped by osmosis, by being the children of trauma survivors. And we will talk a lot more, I will talk a lot more to you about what does it mean, what that osmosis means. How do we get these effects? How do they get transmitted to us? What gets transmitted to us? And the reason that it's so important to understand what gets transmitted and how is because, far from the effects of the Holocaust being really limited to what we know about the Holocaust and our guilt towards our parents because they suffered so much, and how can we be angry with them, or what should we tell them and not tell them, and kavod avve'em, and beyond all of that, this is think about a stone in the water. When a stone falls into water, it makes many circles. The closest circle is the stuff that's related directly, thematically, to the Holocaust. But the bigger circles around it have to do with other things. It's the way that you learn to be with yourself. For example, if you have to continuously be aware of the pain of your parents, then it becomes a force in your life that shapes who you are. That means that if you, for better and for worse, yes, it may be a force that evolves to an accentuated focus on empathy, and it can be a good thing, but it can also be a force that becomes a non-conscious, I say non-conscious, not unconscious, something that you don't even notice, pulls you always to be or not to be certain things depending on the pain of the other person or what the other person needs from you, the persons that matter to you, yes? Which in more extreme cases we refer to as psychopathological adaptation, which means a child grows up, instead of feeling that they can be whoever they are, they sort of prune themselves continuously relative to what their parents can tolerate or what causes the parents pain. Well, it may sound very nice in terms of kibud av va'em, but in terms of the development of the identity of the child, their ability to be in good contact with what matters to them, with what's good for them, with their the things that they're most passionate about, their capacity to differentiate their own identity, their capacity to be a lot of things that we will talk a lot more about, those things can suffer from it. We can become too good for our own good. We can become too kind for our own good, and we can lose certain aspects of ourselves in that process. It stunts certain aspects of our personality, especially since in order to be able to be spontaneous, for example, or assertive, appropriately assertive, yes, you have to have a certain sense of innate confidence in your capacity to behave whichever way, and it will be okay. And the other person will not crumble, or it will not be terrible, in order for you to be okay with your natural assertiveness. But if you're continuously checking to make that when you say to your parent at the age of 13 what 13-year-olds need to start saying, lo rotze, or no, or which, in a polite way, more or less, in whichever way, that whole process of differentiating from the parent and becoming your own person, if you are afraid to do it because of the pain of your parent, which we all have to be able to sustain to some extent if we're healthy parents. Some degree of pain is part and parcel of this job, right? And if we can't do it, and if the child knows that we can't do it and is protecting us from every bit of it, then it's going to become very difficult for that child to be assertive with other people, to be in contact with what they want, even when it's okay for them to say, you know what, to a husband or to a boss or to a friend or to a whatnot, you know what, no, that doesn't suit me, lo mat'im li, no, that not, and no. We have to be able to do that also in order to be in healthy relationships. So there are a lot of things that are not in the immediate circle around the theme of the Holocaust. They're already completely divorced from the theme of the Holocaust, and yet they are in the wider circles related to growing up with a parent who has a very traumatic past and a child who's aware of the pain of the parent. Exactly. And this is, I'm glad that you're saying that. And it goes to all the mentioning of guilt. Yes? Because this is the cost. And I think that some of the cleaning up of the mud has to do with us both understanding our parents as people. We can grow up and become, kind of white-haired and older, but it doesn't necessarily mean that all of our parts inside have matured optimally. We can, but really I think maturing and coming to a good place where we would like to be at this point in life is being able to truly understand our parents as people and understand how they dealt the best way they could with an impossible situation that they were placed in and what it did to them, and at the same time extend a similar degree of comprehension and compassion to our younger self and what our younger self had to do in its place to maintain its life and vitality. So, if our young self had enough spunk and enough health, which, by the way, your parents in the end, and that's one of I think the most powerful statements that I can offer you in my experience. Your parents, for the most part, even the abusive Holocaust survivor's parent, for the most part, they loved their children. They were PTSD'd. They didn't control themselves. They had terrible rage outbursts in which they acted terribly, but they loved their children. And therefore, what I'm saying is, if they could be the way they would have wanted to be, they would have wanted you to be happy. They would have wanted you not to have suffered by their PTSD and by their mishigas. They would have wanted their children to be happy and successful. They couldn't overcome their PTSD. They couldn't overcome a lot of things that they had to deal with, but they would have wanted it. So if we actually were lucky enough to have had enough health in us as young children to have the spunk to go against it, and if we did cause them a little bit of pain or a lot of pain. Some kids caused a lot of pain. There were some troublemaker kids who caused a lot of pain. And those were the kids who had to cause a lot of pain. For the most part, they were guys. They were the sons, for the most part. There were also daughters, but mostly they were sons who felt so much choked and not allowed to become, that they had to become the troubled kids. And they caused a lot of trouble. So whichever degree of trouble we caused, we also now, from the position of people our age, must have compassion for that young self and say, wow, you know what, on some level, good for you. Good for you that you had the spunk, that you had enough health, that it pushed you towards healthy development and differentiation of self and gave you the strength to do that despite the impact of the trauma on the entire family. And if you caused your parents pain in the process, forgive yourself, because in some ways, it's the part of you that were the healthier that saved you. And your parents would have forgiven you if they could. In retrospect, at the last cheshbon, they would have forgiven you because that's what allowed you to be you today and not somebody in a psychiatric hospital or on the streets. Even if they said that they wouldn't, even if they said that they wish they didn't survive because what kind of a terrible child they have, and all of those things that we heard. Yes. Okay.
Question: what do I do about my siblings who won't come here because they think they don't need help?
I think there are indeed different degrees and nuances, but there are a lot of people who don't want to deal with that. And yes, second generation who don't want to deal with this, don't want to admit. We have, in Israel, we had a whole generation of my older brother and sister that was all organized around it. We were sabras. We had nothing to do with it. We had nothing to do with the diaspora. We had nothing to do with any victimhood. We were fighters. We were strong. We were independent. The entire generation had to gain distance from it. And some people are still in that posture. And some people grow out of it and come to a place of, okay. And this is why this is a good age to do it, I find, because we've already proven many things to ourselves. We've proven that we are normal, that we are functioning, that we're okay, and we can now look a little bit into that. I have to be good and stop on time because I promised 8:30, that's enough. And I just want to say again, I really thank you for being here.